Hello, Biblionauts. Welcome to the third installment of the best books of 2024, Better Late Than Never. And this is the genre that I am probably known for, my blueprint in BookTube, the genre I've defended the most and attacked the most. This is the 10 or more or less, I don't know, I haven't counted them actually, best books of philosophy that I have read on 2024. Very uneven, like the other tops. The first half, it's good, but it's more like books that I loved because I like the subject and they're relevant on that subject, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend to everyone. And the second half are like must reads, or either of their discipline or in general as a human being. One disclaimer, as you probably should know by now if you follow me, is that I don't believe that there's such a thing as non-fiction. I think that anything that is written pretty much is a fiction. I think that pretty much everything that is exercised through language is a fiction to a certain degree. But without even going to such a radical degree of argumentation, I will just say that if you think of something like, just to give you an example, a book that is not on this list, at the beginning of the year I read the Carta Magna because I was having a trial and I was like, let's read the Carta Magna. That brings me to the Constitution, for example. That's a fiction. Does it permeate the world? Does it like affect our reality? For sure. But it affects our reality because it's a fiction that we choose to believe, not different from the Bible, another book of fiction. With the things that, like the fact that something affects reality doesn't mean that it's not fiction. And whether or not it becomes real is just whether or not we choose to embody that fiction. Because of that, I don't think the dichotomy between fiction and non-fiction makes sense. I don't think that philosophy or non-fiction should have a higher moral stance than literature, for example, because I do divide between philosophy and literature, not fiction and non-fiction, because of having some sort of like higher epistemological stance than one than the other. Because of that, philosophy on one side, that is content books that focus on the content of what they're writing, of what they're trying to say, and literature books that focus on the form, what is being said, the way that it's being said, more than what is being said. I'm like stuttering, right? Just to give you an example with Julio Cortázar, he has a short story on brushing his teeth and another one on a watch. There are things that are being said there, but what's interesting about it is the way they are being said. If you read a book on non-fiction, how to brush your teeth, like that wouldn't make it any top. But certainly, stories of Cronopios and Famas from Cortázar would make all of my tops. So that being said, let's go into my philosophy pile, and we start with one book that, I actually have a few here that I didn't bring because I don't have them in physical form, so I'll just go quickly through them. Two very specific books that I cannot really recommend unless you're interested in the subject. I've read around, not that many, like without counting like actually study material for the different courses that I've done in the scuba diving world. Just for fun, I've read around 20 books about scuba diving in my life. And the two that I read this year are two of the best on their subject, and I love them, and because of that I want to recommend them. One is Technically Speaking, which is like a nice historical overview of rebreather diving and technical diving in general, and Cave Diving, which is all sort of like fields of diving that I either practice love or that I am very fascinated and I want to sort of like explore more. Rebreather diving is really the only form of diving that I am completely new to, that I haven't yet explored to its full extent. And Technically Speaking, which is sort of like, what I liked about that book is that it gives like amazing anecdotes, which is super relatable for anybody with enough experience, will have experienced most of the things that are said there, or a lot of them. And it's a really nice overview also of like the main diving standards and rules of conduct and all of that. So I do recommend them if you are already interested in scuba diving. I don't think they are nice introductory books. I think these books are nice if you're already into it. Another one that I would love to be able to sort of like introduce into the list because it was a good book, but I just like I didn't read it with enough focus, and I was a little bit I was kind of holding back through the whole thing, and I also was doing my own things. It's not that I am a seasonal reader, but I do a lot of things. So depending on what I am doing, it influences well like how much I like what I'm reading or not. That's why, for example, Horace poetry, which it's not as amazing as I felt it was when I read it. It impacted me so much because I was reading it while I was going through Rome with a bicycle. But at that same time, I was also reading this book, The Spiritual Exercises of Ignatius Loyola. And although I did agree with all the comments that Steve says on a video that I watched a long time ago where he recommended it, and it's the reason why I made my list, about sort of like it being a book a lot more than just about sort of like finding God, but just a book about like discernment and the true possession of one's own mind and mental capacity and everything. And regardless of whether or not Loyola did in fact want you to arrive at the conclusion that God exists, it is still a lot about the existence of God, and it's very Christian. It was very hard for me to sort of like separate, and at some point it became a bit repetitive, and I didn't enjoy it as much. I think partially because I was not paying enough attention. I was kind of trying to get through it, as I was trying to get also through the specific section of the of my route with the bicycle, and I just didn't want to lose too much time on that. I also audiobooked Thomas Paine on the Age of Reason. I loved the experience. I think it's amazing prose. It's just one of those books that, to me, it's like, we have the expression in Spanish, like, estoy de vuelta y media. It means like I've gone and come back and gone again. Like, all of these books I find interesting. I say all of these books because I also was audiobooking The Story of Philosophy from Will Durant, and I got the physical copy, and I was loving it so much because I went into The Story of Philosophy from Will Durant, and I was loving the whole thing because I was giving some really good examinations or analysis of Kant and Spinoza and Francis Bacon. I even got interested in Francis Bacon for the first time in my life. I actually never really liked him, and then I got to the second half, and it was just like super lazy. It felt like he just wanted to brush off the subject and go on to some other book, and the analysis became so much more superficial, and I got a little bit disappointed with the outcome of that book. But these books, for me, they have in common the fact that sort of like they defend scientific thinking, they defend reason, they preach to something that is important. I mean, it's not that they preach, but I mean that they preach to the converted, in the sense that like there's not much for me to gather from them that I don't already know. As you will see from my choice for number one book of this year, I am already on a different page in my way of philosophically approach the subject of reason and philosophical thinking and truth aligned and all of that. Which is not to say that these books are wrong in any way. I think The Age of Reason is like an amazing book, and I would recommend this one much more than my number one choice for this year, just because it's a very good introductory point to a number of subjects, such as sort of like superstition. But partially because of the moment I was reading it, and partially because of I was listening to it, and partially because of my own personal interests and fields of intellectual exploration, I wasn't too surprised. Similarly with this, I didn't finish this one because it happened, and it ended up being I saw it on the channel recently, so that's why I'm saying I didn't finish it. It ended up being a series of articles that Fernando Lázaro Carreter already published in other places, and I ended up knowing so many of them already. Like it was basically, I found myself rereading more than I was reading, all on the subject of language and how language is in a process of decay, and why it should be preserved, and why we should use it to its full extent, and like how to revive Spanish vocabulary. This is all about Spanish language, and probably there is like an equivalent of English language for the same sort of thesis, because part of the problem, not the problem, but part of the challenge that language is facing right now is globalization and social media, and that affects to any global language, but especially to a global language like Spanish or English. It's an enjoyable read, and because of that I still recommend it, but it's not nuanced if you already are aware of this. So I'd say this is sort of like number 10 if I had to make a top 10 because of that. if you are familiar with this, you might enjoy it because, you know, especially if you are learning Spanish or you're already really fluent. I would never read this on translation. It would be a complete waste of time. You would be able to enjoy, if you are already fluent with the language, to see what he does, and he's very humoristic as well. The rhetoric is nice, but I don't know. There's like shorter books in this list that do the thing rather than talking about doing the thing. Although he kind of does both, but I don't know. It's a long book, you know, for what it has to say. I'm not sure I can say read that whole book cover to cover. Much rather just like read one of the articles. Maybe I can make a specific video about one of them. Similar with Mark Fisher, I really like Mark Fisher. He wrote what to me is like one of the most important philosophy books, not only ever written, but definitely written in the 21st century. That is Capital Realism. The idea that we sort of like stagnated as a society because we cannot conceive of a future that doesn't include capitalism within it, and because we cannot think of alternatives, therefore we are sort of like unable to reformulate that which is wrong with our society. And this book is full of his pessimism. This is not a translation. It's called The Ghost of My Life, and it goes over that, over like, you know, the no future society that we have created, and the cultural artifacts. He talks a lot about pop culture, especially music in this case, that enable us to, in some way or other, criticize or combat those dynamics. I have to say about that book, is not the way I would start with Mark Fisher. I think Mark Fisher wrote one masterpiece, and it's Capital Realism. If you read that and you fall in love with him, then keep reading him, but definitely don't start with The Ghost of My Life, because it's a little bit obscure, not for other reason. I forgot to say as well, in relation to this book, it also reminded me another one that I read, Tsing by Mushroom at the End of the World. And this one I read in tandem. Tsing was a little bit too philosophical. I think it was an amazing book, but it defended sort of like some of the theses that I already heard so many times in my philosophy degree, and I also, when I was reading Byung-Chul Han in translation, there was a book that I read from him in Spanish that was some title, something like The Society of Tiredness or something like that. But he has is the same sort of like philosophy of like, because we have instrumental reasoning, we have a goal-oriented personalities, and everything is about extraction because of the capitalist society in which we live, and the culture industry and all of that. We're not able to do anything just for the sake of doing it, right? And we should. And Tsing's Tsing book, The Mushroom at the End of the World, looks at the Japanese mushroom picking practices. Well, it's not just Japanese, it's like all over. And how they are an example of non-goal oriented practices, or at least non-capitalistic minded practices that can illustrate a new way of like living and relating to the natural world and to ourselves. Simultaneously, I also read this, Braiding Sweetgrass. I like this one a lot more. I have to say, yeah, I really like this book. There's nothing I have to say. I actually really like this book, and there's no objection to that. It's beautifully written. It's also the book that I think coined the sort of idea of indigenous ways of thinking, and that's because it has a very valid, and unlike sort of like some of the arguments that it engendered, it has some really interesting insights on like non-scientific ways of thinking, and yet communicating sort of like indigenous ways of thinking, you know, that also communicate in a sort of scientific way toward the natural world, in a more phenomenological sense of the word, and how sort of like that indigenous mindset in terms of what Robin Wall Kimmerer, really? I thought it was should be a female. I think maybe that's a female name. Yeah, what she considers could inform a much better relationship toward the natural world. I lost my train of thought. This is an amazing book. It's super enjoyable. It's also in some ways a cozy read. It's very introspective. It has some really nice even self-criticism. There's a part that to me I felt super identified with, where like, you know, she had been teaching her kids about like, you know, living in symbiosis with the natural world and everything, and then she found herself sort of like removing plants and insects from a pond that she had made so that her kids could swim on this completely sterile pond, which looked cleaner because it had no life in it. And she realized that she was like embodying like a big hypocrisy by doing that. And I think that whole scene that I read here, that for me is like the part that stayed with me all the time, makes me think a lot about my own thesis about how we relate to the natural world, which is the same way that, I don't know, a taxidermist relates to animals, where we just want to sort of like contain them and like remove everything that makes them what they are, and then because of that, by oversimplifying and by destroying them in the way that sort of like the non-identical is destroyed in the Lyotard terms, being able to possess it. I really, really recommend it. This is not academic. This is just like, it feels like a memoir. It's a lot more than that, but yeah. This is probably the most fun essay I've read. I loved it. I picked it up because I went to a school as a kid that had the name of this guy, Francisco Sanchez. And I was like, okay, let's see why this guy named my school, or like why my school was named after him. And I mean, when I was in third primary school or something like that, but somehow I still remember the name. And the title is Que nada se sabe, that nothing is known. And it's basically a skeptic, but it's he was not a philosopher necessarily. I think he was like a doctor. And he was writing this over, I think, 20 years as well. Took a long time. And it shows because the rhetoric is impeccable, is super poetic in some ways, like it uses alliteration. There are some parts that I really would like to commit to heart at some point when I revisit it. It's one of my favorite essays of all time at this point. And my favorite, I think he might be my second favorite skeptic after Hume. What else? Oh yeah, Hegel, Phenomenology of Spirit. Hours and hours and hours of videos already on YouTube from my side about this book. I will link some of them in the description. I will link anything else that I can in the description from me or somebody else. I don't have much to say about this except that I cannot recommend it unless you are like a hard lover of philosophy already. This is as hard as they say. It's not the hardest philosophy book of all time. It's the hardest Western philosophy book of all time. There's lots of Jewish mysticists and Eastern mysticists that are much harder to read. But yeah, this book is incredibly influential. This is a gem for the mind if you manage to read it without bending. And that's the hard thing with some of these books, that it's very hard to finish one of these books and not finish on the other side, having understood what it says, and not call yourself a Hegelianist. And that's part of what they're trying, you know. That's the ultimate Nietzschean truth, that all philosophers are autobiographies to a certain degree. But there's definitely a lot here that will sort of like be very interesting just to read about and to discover as on a very sort of like abstract ontological sense. You have to really be into philosophy. You have to like be seduced by terms like mutual recognition or synthesis, not synthesis, but negation of negation. Like if you are already vaguely familiar with these topics and you are willing to like have tons of secondary reading or even go to classes or something, and want to sort of decipher something that is more like a puzzle than a book, then definitely go for it. But this will take you a lot more than a book this size should take. I recommend it. I've spent more time with that book than probably with every other book on this list together. But it's for a reason. Like it's a how to say, paradigm changing experience as a philosophy reader. The Empire of Cotton. This book could be number one on the list, if for one single fault that it has, in my opinion. But first, before talking about that one fault, I'll talk about what this is. This is The Empire of Cotton by Sven Beckert, and this is the ultimate deconstruction, or like the black book of capitalism. This is like this explains through one material that explains to you why one material, cotton, has determined everything about your world, wherever you are and whoever you are. Colonialism wouldn't be as we know it without cotton. Obviously, your privilege, your clothing would not be as you know it without it. Slavery wouldn't have existed in the way that we have known it throughout history without it. Globalization wouldn't have happened the way it happened. The Industrial Revolution wouldn't have happened the way it happened. So many things. This book is so far. This might be the most. I'm trying to think, but I think this might be the most interesting world history that I have read in my life. Because I don't know. I before reading this book, I thought maybe coffee or sugar were bigger in terms of like their influence and permeation and like all of that. No, cotton. It's it really like without this material and without what we have done to extract it from different places and the different the economic and geopolitical battle that began with it long before you could even imagine. The world as we know it would not be the way it is. And maybe some other material would have taken over, but we'll never know. The fact is that this is your history, is the history of your world, wherever you are, for good or for ill. You should know it. The only bad thing that it has, and the reason why it's here, is because I don't know if Sven Beckett is German, but I think he might be because he writes like a German. I find his prose really dry, and it was a little bit hard to get through it. But it's dense because it's very informative and has a lot to say. This is a massive history that could book probably. It feels like it could have been twice the length. So you gotta give it to him. It's you cannot be on every single front at the same time, but the prose, it does suffer on the prose a little bit, on my opinion. Another book is The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, yeah, by Susanna Zuboff. And as of today, as of the present, this is the most relevant book that you could read probably. This is not just about how you have privacy, but about how this device, which has become an extension of you, whoever you are, is really a conduct through which a series of multinationals manipulate you and treat you not as a client, as you might think, as a customer, no, as a raw material for the real customers, which is the companies that advertise themselves through its multiple platforms. It's about everything really to do with media and with social media specifically. But particularly things that come through this device and about how they affect your psyche and how they are interrelated with capitalism again. I mean, like you gotta know the system that you inhabit. If you are in the zoo, you better know things about zoos. I think this book is one of the most important books that has been written on this century. That I know of, with my very limited knowledge, and somehow I do claim the authority to even say that sentence, but why not? Everyone is here preaching in this platform, anyways. Another non-fiction book that I forgot because I think I talked about it on top of the previous year, but I did read this year, was the non-fiction book about Black Beauty that was published, I think, also last year. It's called On Writing Black Beauty. It was an amazing book to read in tandem with the book Black Beauty. I can put the link in the description or something, but that's also a nice book, as an honorary mention. But you have to really sort of like be into the whole subject. I found it very interesting because I was studying naturalism in general. I think I'm gonna run out of memory before I finish my top. So let's talk about number one, The Myth of Disenchantment by Jason Storm. This I think is one of the most important philosophers alive today. And this book is foundational for the one that came after, which is a book that I will probably be analyzing deeply throughout this year, perhaps in tandem with To Read Is My Concern, because we've been talking about it and I think he's interested in it. And this is ahead of the subject. If you read any book on enchantment, on the history of magic or anything like that, just know that this book, like in some way, like rules them all out. It's ahead. It's ahead of the whole conversation. It gathers a bunch of data that immediately completely refutes the fact that we are disenchanted in any way. Then explains that being enchanted or disenchanted has nothing to do with being secular and or with secularization in general. There's no correlation, and also that that regulative ideal of like disenchantment is just some fallacious wall through which we can hide ourselves to believe that we are disenchanted, and in fact that allows us the way in which we're enchanted, our superstitions to dominate us, when in fact we should embrace them consciously and parallelly, not in conflict or perpendicularly to our reason. This is insane. This is an amazing book. This is philosophy. It's academic, but it's everything that you would want it to be. This is an amazing mind, and he knows his subject back and forth. I really like this guy. I have to say bye now because I don't want the video to get cut because of the memory. But yeah, these are the books. I'll sort them like this one last time, and with this I say goodbye.